Every true crime channel and film bro podcast throws the word psychopath around like it's a compliment. But as a clinical psychologist, there's only one horror villain who actually clears the bar for what that word technically means. I love Hannibal Lecter, but it's not him. Fun to watch, great table manners for a cannibal. Clinically, real psychopathy never once cared about being fun to watch. Anton Chigurh is the real thing, the closest thing American film has produced to primary psychopathy on screen. And the scary part isn't the cattle gun or the body count. It's that he never once breaks a sweat doing any of it. No monologue or lime pairing, nor fava beans. Just the guy who kills you the same way you unload a dishwasher. What would you actually do if a stranger asked you to call a coin flip and wouldn't tell you the stakes? Be honest with yourself for a second. Because the answer that everyone gives is I walk away. And the answer is actually stand there and call it. Because the second option in that gas station isn't leaving. It's finding out what happens if you don't play. That's the whole trick of this character sitting inside one scene. He never has to threaten you out loud. He just lets his silence sit there long enough for your own imagination to write the threat for him. Free of charge. We're taking apart the most clinically accurate psychopath American film has produced, played by Javier Bardem in a performance so unsettling it won him an Oscar and apparently gave the entire generation a permanent fear of small talk with strangers at gas stations. We're going scene by scene. The silence and the coin, his weapon. Is Chigurh chaos, or is he something far more organized than chaos? Something that only looks random to the people standing too close to notice the difference before it's too late. Keep that question loose in your head. We're answering it properly, and you're not going to love where it lands. Before diagnosis, the file needs to be straight. No Country for Old Men is a 2007 film directed by Joel and Ethan Coen, adapted from Cornyn McCartney's novel of the same name. The story follows Llewelyn Moss, a veteran played by Josh Brolin, who stumbles onto the wreckage of a drug deal completely sideways out in the Texas desert. Bodies everywhere, a truck full of heroin, and one briefcase sitting untouched holding $2 million in cash. Moss takes the money. That decision made him about 30 seconds of temptation out in the dirt is the whole reason the rest of the movie happens to him. Anton Chigurh gets hired by the people who lost that money to get it back. He tracks Moss across Texas, and the body count along the way includes almost anybody unlucky enough to end up standing between him and the cash, plus a fair number of people who have nothing to do with the money at all and just happen to be in the wrong doorway. Running underneath this whole chase is Sheriff Ed Tom Bell, played by Tommy Lee Jones, an aging lawman several steps behind the entire time, watching a shape of violence enter his county that he doesn't have the tools to understand, let alone stop. Here's what makes this file different from almost every villain we've covered on this channel. Chigurh gets no backstory, nothing. No dead parent or childhood abuse, no origin scene walking through how the person becomes this. He just shows up already fully formed and convinced of his own philosophy. And the film doesn't apologize for that or try to soften him with an explanation. That's not the writers being lazy. That's the entire point of the character. Some horror doesn't need a why. And some horror, it's scary because there's no comforting explanation available to hand you. Nothing you can use to convince yourself this couldn't happen anywhere near you. Chigurh isn't described in his source material as some hulky monster either, and that matters more than people give it credit for. He's described as almost looking unremarkable, someone you could walk past on a sidewalk without a second glance, right up until you're close enough to notice his eyes don't track a room the way a normal person's eyes would. Most villains announce themselves the second they walk into frame. Chigurh doesn't announce anything. He waits for you to notice too late, which is exactly the kind of quiet you should be paying attention to in real life, not just on screen. Compare that to almost all the slashers we covered. Michael Myers wears a mask specifically so you know instantly what you're dealing with. Freddy shows up wearing a sweater loud enough to be seen from across the mall food court. Chigurh doesn't need a costume because his entire costume is looking like nobody at all. That's far more efficient design than anything a slasher franchise ever bothered inventing. Why spend money on a mask when your own face already does the job of making people underestimate you completely? Even the haircut is doing quiet work on you. And I don't think that's an accident either. Bardem plays the whole role under a heavy, almost childlike page boy cut. The kind of thing you'd see on a kid in the 80s or 70s. Not a professional killer. That choice isn't comic relief, even though plenty of people online treat it that way. In the comment section of every clip, it's doing the same job the flat voice does. It strips away every visual cue your brain normally uses to sort somebody into threat. So by the time you correctly filed him under that category, he's already standing closer than you'd like. If you remember the very first scene, he it shows you what he's capable of before the coin and the cattle gun. It tells you almost everything about how the rest of the file is going to go. He's arrested early in the movie, sitting handcuffed in the back of a police car, while a deputy calls in the rest, completely unbothered by any of it. Within a minute, he's freed his hands, wrapped the chain of the cuffs around the deputy's throat from behind, and strangled him to death without raising his voice or heart rate seeming to move at all, as far as the scene shows you. There's an actual name for what you're watching in that scene, and it's worth naming early because it's going to matter for the rest of this file. Researchers studying psychopathy have consistently found something called autonomic underarousal, which is a fancy way of describing a nervous system that just doesn't spike the way a normal person does under threat or during violence. Low resting heart rate has been called one of the most reliably replicated biological markers tied to antisocial behavior in the research, and it's been linked repeatedly to fearlessness and sensation seeking in exactly the population you'd expect. In plain terms, most people's bodies scream at them before they ever do something like this. Hands shaking, pulse racing, some part of the nervous system trying to slam the brakes. Chigurh's body doesn't send that message. And the film shows you that absence in the very first scene instead of making you wait for a monologue to explain it. What happens right after is the part that gets under people's skin more than strangling. Minutes after killing a police officer with his bare hands, Chigurh pulls over an innocent motorist using the stolen patrol car, walks up to the window with a friendly, almost helpful look on his face, and kills him just as calmly to take the vehicle. That smile is an enjoyment. It's not even a real expression of anything happening underneath it. It's bait, the same way a lure is bait. Because a smiling stranger gets their guard down than a serious scowling one would never. The driver doesn't know what's happening to him. And that gap is exact gap the whole character lives inside for the rest of the film. The movie puts the scene first for a reason. It's not there to explain his motives because it never bothers explaining his motives at any point. It's there to calibrate you. Everything scary that happens after this, you're now watching correctly because the film already showed you in the first 10 minutes exactly what this man is willing to do and exactly how little it cost him to do it. For context on just how casual this is for him, most on screen killers need a reason before they pick up a weapon. Grudge, check, bad childhood. Somebody's going to explain in flashback around minute 40. Chigurh needed a set of handcuffs he was already wearing and about 90 seconds of nobody watching closely enough. That's not a character flaw the writers are writing. To explain later. That's just another day for this guy. And then the film doesn't treat it worth commenting on either. And that makes it worse, kind of, right? Quick word on Moss before we go farther. Because his part is doing real work against Sugar. Even though Moss isn't a villain, he's capable and a veteran. He knows how to survive rough terrain. And for a stretch of the film, he actually manages to stay a step ahead. The film wants you to believe, for a little bit, that competence might be enough to survive this. Then it isn't. Moss dies off screen almost as an afterthought, killed by completely different criminals who have nothing to do with Sugar's pursuit. In a motel room, the film doesn't even let us watch. Sit with how deliberately unsatisfying that choice is. After building him up for 2 hours as the resourceful guy that can actually pull it off, he doesn't get a final showdown at all. He just dies somewhere off camera to somebody else's violence entirely. That's the film telling you that this was never really a story about what if Moss can outsmart him. It's about how little competence matters about this world. Here's a scene where most people remember as tense without clocking it as exactly why. Because the Coen brothers are doing something rare here. Chigurh walks into a small hardware store to buy supplies for the manhunt. Ordinary items, nothing dramatic on paper. There's barely any music in this entire film, and this scene has none at all. Just the sound of a cash register, boots on wood floor, a clerk making small talk he has no idea is dangerous. That absence of score is doing more heavy lifting than a full orchestra ever could. Most thrillers tell you when to be scared with music, a low string swell, a percussive sting right before the jump. This film refuses that comfort entirely. And that means every ordinary sound gets weaponized instead. A door hinge, footsteps, the particular way Chigurh pauses half a second too long before answering a completely normal question. Without music cueing your nervous system, your brain has to do the work itself, scanning every small detail in the scene for danger, the same way it would if you were actually standing in that store. And that's exactly the sensation the Coens are doing. They're not scoring the scene, they're making you do the scoring in your own head. And in our own head, it's always scarier than a string section. You could see the same thing in the shootout, and it doesn't play out like a typical action sequence. There's no triumphant swell when Moss lands a hit, no dramatic slow motion, just fast, ugly, disorienting violence that ends abruptly and moves on, usually leaving somebody wounded in a way that isn't clean or cinematic at all. That refusal to give violence a satisfying rhythm is deliberate because real violence doesn't have a rhythm. It's chaotic and it's over faster than you expect. And these people bleeding in unglamorous positions are unglamorous floors. The film wants that discomfort and it works. It wants you leaning forward, then settling back. Think about how differently a modern studio thriller would handle this exact same hardware store scene. There'd be a slow zoom on Sugar's face, a low drone build underneath, maybe a title card counting down somewhere in the corner, just to make sure you got the memo that something's bad about to happen. The Coens hand you nothing. You get a guy buying bandages and asking a clerk about a car wreck up the road, and the horror is just what you already know about him from 20 minutes earlier, sitting in your own chest with nowhere to put it. That's a much harder trick to pull off than a jump scare. And it's a big part of why this film still gets brought up nearly 2 decades later. There's a stretch of this film built almost on two men in adjoining rooms who never see each other. Moss is holed up in the motel, and Chigurh is somewhere nearby, closing in through nothing but sound and instinct. Cohen's built the entire scene from an airbend, the kind that you never Odin's in a hotel room, until a film like this trains you to. There's a light under the door that shouldn't be there. There's a squeak from a vent cover being unscrewed slowly enough that you could barely hear it until you realize what it means. There's this specific dread of watching Moss realize in real time that the wall between him and Chigurh isn't actually a wall at all. It's a suggestion. And this man has already found a way through it before Moss even knew he was there. No dialogue for stretches at a time or score. Just two men, one hunting and one hunted, communicating entirely through the absence of noise between them. This is Chigurh's patience on full display, because patience isn't usually what makes a villain scary on screen. Most horror threats are fast or loud or both. Chigurh is none. He moves the way he has to move, not faster or slower. And the film is more disturbing than a chase could ever be, because a predator that is willing to wait in complete silence, adjusting a screw at a time, is a predator that's already decided the outcome. He's not rushing, because rushing means doubt whether he's going to win or not. And doubt is a feature that this man doesn't come with. There's something almost insulting about how unbothered he seems the whole time, too. And I mean that in the way you'd feel insulted watching someone solve a puzzle you've been stuck on for an hour without even sitting down first. Moss is a trained veteran, armed, alert, running on pure adrenaline in that room. Chigurh's working through the whole sequence with the energy of somebody doing light home maintenance on a Saturday afternoon. That mismatch and urgency between the two of them is the entire horror of the scene. And it's uncomfortable feeling to sit with as a viewer, watching somebody survive on desperation against somebody who isn't desperate. Let's talk about the detail everyone remembers, even if they saw this movie once. Across the movie, Sugar occasionally offers certain people a choice. Call the coin correctly and you live. Call it wrong, and you don't. On the surface, this reads like a strange, almost merciful court. A killer who at least gives some people a fighting chance. Underneath the surface is one of the most unsettling psychological mechanisms put on screen in the last few decades. So let's actually break down why. When Chigurh flips that coin, he's not handing over any real power at all. He's the one that decides a coin flip would happen in the first place. He's the one who decides the stakes. He's standing there with the loaded weapon, regardless of which way the coin lands. What he's actually doing is outsourcing the responsibility for a decision he's already made, letting fate take the blame so he never has to sit with the fact that he's choosing every single time to be the kind of person willing to kill somebody over a coin toss to begin with. If you flip a coin knowing full well you built the entire situation the coin is supposedly deciding, Are you really letting fate decide anything? Or are you just giving yourself permission to do what you already wanted to do while keeping your hands looking clean on the way out? That's the trick sitting underneath the whole coin flip. It's not mercy, it's a man constructing an elaborate excuse so he never has to experience himself as a murderer making a choice. He gets to experience himself as an instrument of something bigger. Fate, chance, or whatever indifferent arithmetic runs the universe, according to him. Anything other than a guy who enjoys being the one holding the gun. That's not humility in front of fate. It's the opposite of humility, wearing fate's clothes to the party. Watch the gas station scene closely if you rewatch this film after hearing this. Chigurh baits the elderly owner into small talk. Ask him what town he's in, needles him about a comment the man makes without realizing he's being needled at all, and slowly cranks the tension until the man has no idea why his own life suddenly seems to be hanging over the price of a bag of cashews. Then the coin comes out. The man doesn't even know what he's calling for. He's being asked to bet his own life without being told the stakes. And that's the entire pattern of how Chigurh runs every relationship in this film. He controls the information, he controls the framing. He lets you make a choice while quietly withholding the one piece of context that would actually let you make it freely. Here's where this scene stops being just clever filmmaking and starts being useful information. Because the gas station owner isn't doing anything most people would also do in his exact position. There's actual security research on exactly this pattern, built by people who study predators for a living, and Chigurh runs almost every technique off the checklist. The security consultant Gavin DeBeggar wrote an entire book breaking down what he calls pre-incident indicators, the small behavioral signals that show up right before somebody with bad intentions make their move. Two of the biggest ones are charm and forced teaming, and Chigurh uses both on that poor man before the coin ever comes out. Charm, according to Becker, isn't a personality trait at all. It's a tool deployed on purpose to lower somebody's guard, and niceness works the exact same way. Somebody being nice to you tells you nothing about their intentions. It only tells you that they decided niceness is the fastest route to get what they want from you. Forced teaming is the other one. When a stranger creates a false sense of we're in this together out of nothing, and Chigurh does a version of this too, chatting about the coin like it's a fun little game between two guys passing time, than what it actually is. And that's just him deciding if this man lives or not. Picture a version of this scene happening to you. I would never want that. Somewhere completely ordinary. Nothing dramatic, nowhere near a gas station in rural Texas. A parking garage at night. Somebody offering to walk you through your car because you're heading the same way anyway. A stranger online who starts every message like you're already old friends. Most of the time, that's nothing. And most people being friendly are just being friendly, right? But the instinct that flags something as slightly off, even when you can't explain why, is worth listening to instead of talking yourself out of. DeBecker's whole argument is that niceness isn't the same thing as goodness. It's a decision somebody makes about how to get what they want. And the people who understand that fastest are usually the ones who walk away from a bad situation before it ever becomes one. That's the real practical use of watching the character like this closely. Noticing that the exact tools this fictional killer uses on a stranger at a gas station show up in smaller and far less dramatic doses in actual manipulative people you might meet at an actual parking lot. Recognizing the pattern in fiction makes it easier to clock in real life, and that's worth more than any jump scare this film could have given you instead. Now let's talk about the cattle gun, because this weapon choice is doing more storytelling than almost any single line of dialogue in the movie. Chigurh's signature tool is a captive bolt pistol, an automatic device that's used in slaughterhouses quickly. It's not built to be used on people at all, and that's the entire point of choosing it. Think about what it means for a man to select a slaughterhouse tool as his weapon of choice against people. He's telling you through the object of self exactly how he sees people he's about to kill. Not people with names or with single moral weight. It's livestock, a task completed efficiently and then forgotten the moment it's finished. He even uses the same compressed air tool to blow deadbolts out of doors instead of picking a lock. And that tells you the whole relationship to the physical world runs on the same logic that he applies to people. Doesn't negotiate, just pressure applied with total confidence. And that pressure, that's all that's actually required. This isn't some costume villain problem built in a workshop specifically to look menacing on camera. It's agricultural equipment you could buy at a farm supply store, which means the heart of this weapon was never really in the object itself. It was always the decision to point ordinary, boring equipment at a person and treat the whole thing like a normal day's errands. The gun didn't need to be reinvented to become terrifying. It just needed the wrong hands holding it and the wrong species standing in front of it. This is where the character gets uncomfortable because Chigurh isn't chaotic. And that's the biggest misread people bring into this film, expecting a typical slasher. He's not random at all. He runs on one of the most rigid, internally consistent moral codes we've profiled on this channel. And that consistency is exactly what makes him so much more disturbing than a killer that kills from impulse. He apologizes sincerely before certain kills, treating the act almost like an unfortunate but necessary consequence of rules set in motion long before he arrived. And one of the most quoted lines in the film, he tells a man, seconds before killing him, that if the rule he followed brought him to this moment, then what use was that rule to begin with? He isn't just threatening the guy, he's critiquing his entire moral framework on the way out the door, like he's doing him some kind of philosophical favor. Think about Sheriff Bell here, because the film is quietly building a comparison between these two men across the whole runtime, and it's one of the sharpest choices in the script. Bell believes in principles too: duty, decency, the old idea that of being a lawman actually means something. But Bell doubts himself a lot, questioning whether any of it still matters in a world that's clearly moved past him, wrestling with his own sense of falling short in the face of violence he can't make sense of. Chigurh never doubts a single thing. Not one frame of this film shows him hesitating about whether his own code is correct or not. Which one of these men actually sounds more unsettling once you frame it that way? The decent man drowning in doubt, or the killer who's never once questioned a decision in his life? Certainty on its own isn't a virtue. Sometimes certainty is just the absence of a conscience wearing a very convincing disguise. There's a specific danger, too, in somebody who's never had to defend their own worldview against real opposition. And Chigurh embodies that completely. Bell gets pushed back on constantly by his deputies and his wife, his own private doubts and 3 in the morning. That friction is uncomfortable, but it's also what keeps moral compass roughly pointed somewhere real. Sugar never gets tested. Nobody in this story is capable of pushing back hard enough to make him reconsider anything. And the philosophy That's never once survived real opposition isn't strong. It's just never been driven across. Most villains in this genre can outrun or at least slow down with ordinary obstacles. Sugar barely seems to register obstacles as obstacles at all. He gets hit by a car later in the film, brutal accident, walks away from it with a badly broken arm, sets the bone himself with items that he bought from the pharmacy, and keeps walking, or just sews up his gunshot wound. He just treats catastrophic injury the same clinical way he treats everything else. A logistics problem to be handled efficiently, then set aside. That relentlessness is doing something specific to you as a viewer, even if you haven't or have clocked it. Most thrillers give you small windows to believe the good guys might actually win. Chigurh closes every window this film tries to open. He tracks Moss using a transponder hidden inside a case of the money itself, meaning Moss could run wherever he wants and never actually gain distance, and removes everyone in his path. The film trains you, scene by scene, to stop hoping for a rescue because it keeps proving that rescue was never actually on the table. Why does the villain, who barely raises his voice and moves with a completely unhurried pace through every scene he's in, feel more dangerous than a villain screaming and sprinting after his victims? Panic singles limits. A panicked killer can be outrun, worn down, tricked. A calm one is telling you without a single word that he's already run the numbers and doesn't need to hurry because he's already decided he's going to win regardless of how fast you move. There's an actual framework real investigators use for exactly this distinction. It explains this film never says out loud. Criminal profilers, going back to the FBI's original behavioral research in the 70s, split violent offenders into two rough categories: organized and disorganized. A disorganized offender acts on impulse and leaves evidence everywhere, and they usually get caught very fast because the whole crime was chaotic from start to finish. And an organized offender plan, they pick their targets deliberately, control the entire scene of the crime, clean up after themselves, and often come across as ordinary, even likable to anyone who needs them outside of what they actually do. Chigurh is a textbook organized offender, and I mean that almost clinically. He targets people carefully, whether that's tracking moths through hidden transponder or working through a list of names methodically instead of killing them randomly. He leaves almost no evidence behind at any scene. He's calm under pressure without raising a single flag. Real world organized offenders share the same profile: average or above average intelligence, methodical and controlled, often the last person anyone would suspect anything. And that's not a coincidence the film stumbled into. That's the writers building a character who tracks almost perfectly onto research investigators actually use to hunt for people like this in reality. Here's the part that should sit with you a little longer than the rest of this section. Disorganized offenders get caught fast because their chaos leaves a trail. Organized offenders are the ones who can operate for years, sometimes decades, before anybody puts the pieces together, because the entire skill set that makes them dangerous is the same skill set that made them completely unremarkable in the meantime. Calm isn't just a personality quirk in this file. It's the actual operating system of the offender type that most likely to get away with it. Let's talk about how he actually talks to people, because Bardem's delivery here is doing extraordinary work. He asks people to repeat themselves, asks small mundane questions in a tone that would be completely unremarkable coming out of anybody else's mouth. That flatness is the entire delivery mechanism for his menace. A person screaming at you gives your nervous system something familiar to respond to. You know what fear is supposed to sound like, so your body organizes around it. Fight or flight kicks in cleanly. A person speaking to you calmly, almost gently, while your life is clearly in danger, short circuits that whole system. Your brain doesn't have a clean folder for polite and lethal at the same time. So it just sits there in the kind of frozen confusion while the danger gets closer. That confusion is the real weapon. The cattle gun is just the thing he uses once the confusion has already done most of the work. Notice too that how often he asks people to repeat the words back to him. Small words, nothing threatening. What are you looking at? What's the most you've ever lost on a coin toss? It's the technique that keeps the other person talking and keeps them off balance trying to guess the right answer while he stays completely in control of the pacing. The loudest people in the room are rarely the ones that we have to watch out for. It's the quiet, patient, endlessly composed one who keeps you guessing right up until it's too late to guess correctly. There is a specific term for the type of violence Chigurh commits. Researchers split aggression into two broad categories. Reactive aggression is hot-blooded, impulsive, and tied to a real emotional trigger in the moment. Instrumental aggression is opposite. It's cold, it's planned, with almost no emotional charge attached to the act itself. It's violence used as a tool than an outlet. Studies on psychopathic offenders specifically have found something worth sitting with here. Compared to non-psychopathic violent offenders, psychopaths are far more likely to commit instrumental violence over reactive violence. That's sugar in one body count in one sentence. Every kill in this film has a purpose. Closing a loose end or removing a witness. Not one of them happens because he lost his temper, because he doesn't appear to have a temper available to him at all. This is exactly why audiences find this specific type of violence so much more disturbing than the usual slasher body count. A killer driven by rage is, in a strange way, more human, more relatable, and more explainable. You can imagine the provocation, even if you don't act on it yourself. A killer who feels nothing while doing the same amount of damage removes that threat of relatability completely. And what's left behind is something that reads less like a person having a bad night and more like a machine executing a task that was built to execute. Quick file on Carson Wells, the rival hitman hired to hunt down Chigurh once he becomes a liability to the people who originally hired him. He's competent and he knows what he's walking into. This isn't some rookie stumbling into a bad situation. None of that matters even a little. Chigurh finds him, sits across from him with total calm, and has an entire conversation about principles and fate before killing him with the same unheard efficiency he applies to everybody else. Wells never even manages to get his gun into play. That scene exists to close off any hope you might have been holding on to. Competence isn't a variable that decides this is the game, and Wells finds out 4 seconds too late to do anything useful with the information. By the end, Chigurh tracks down Carla Jean, Moss's wife, played by Kelly MacDonald, a woman who never touched a dollar of that money and never made one decision that put her in this man's path, except loving somebody who did. He offers her the coin, the same choice he's offered everybody else, and she refuses to play along. She tells him plainly that the coin doesn't decide anything. He does. It's just him standing there making a choice and letting a piece of metal take the credit. For 2 hours, Chigurh has hidden behind the fiction that fate runs this whole operation and he's merely its instrument. Carla Jean, maybe the last 30 seconds of her life, refuses to let him keep hiding behind that story. She names the mechanism out loud, right to his face, with nothing left to lose. Does he flinch? Not visibly, but the film lingers on him just long enough afterward, checking the bottom of his boots for blood on the way out the door, in a moment that's almost darkly funny after everything that just happened. And that refusal to resolve it neatly is exactly the kind of discomfort this film trusts you to carry out of the theater with you. Push the timeline forward to the accident because it's the scene that ties the entire film's philosophy together in a way that's almost too clean to be an accident or on the writer's part. Driving through an ordinary suburban neighborhood in the middle of the day, Chigurh gets broadsided by another car running a stop sign. There was no plan, or it was just an accident. Just bad luck and an intersection. The exact same indifferent arithmetic he spent the whole film dressing up as destiny whenever it happened to work in his favor. Chigurh climbs out of the wreck, blood running down, and the scene doesn't play like horror at all. It plays almost mundane. Two boys on bikes ride up, curious then scared, asking if he's okay. He negotiates with them calmly, offering cash for one of their shirts to use as a makeshift sling, and they take the deal like it's a completely normal Tuesday afternoon transaction. Nobody screams or calls for help. The most feared killer in the film just sits there on a suburban curb doing business with two children who have absolutely no idea what they're standing 3 feet away from because nothing loud happens in it. This isn't a haunted house or a dark alley. It's a sunny street with lawns and mailboxes and kids on bikes. And horror just sits down on the curb like it belongs there. Because apparently it does. Life doesn't stop or rearrange itself around this man's presence. It just keeps moving awkwardly around him. You probably met a smaller version of this energy before, maybe with no cattle gun involved at all. Just somebody who made you feel, for reasons you couldn't fully explain in the moment, that something underneath their friendliness just didn't add up right. That's why he lands the way he does. He's not asking you to imagine a monster. He's asking you to recognize a pattern you already have instinctive familiarity with, and it just turn up to a volume most people are lucky enough to never actually meet in real life. Have you ever been in a room with somebody whose calm felt slightly off, slightly too controlling for the situation that you were both standing in? That instinct, that one that quietly flags about this person doesn't track, even when you can't name why, is worth trusting. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition doing exactly the job it involved to do. Here's the file laid out plain. Chigurh presents as a profound case as psychopathy layered over self-build's philosophy of fate, one specifically constructed to let him experience total control while insisting that he's just an instrument of forces bigger than himself. Clinically, this is worth naming directly. Researchers actually split psychopathy into two rough lanes: primary and secondary. Secondary psychopathy tends to run hot underneath and anxious, impulsive, often traceable to a rough history, even if the behavior on the surface looks cold. Primary psychopathy, that is the lane that stays cold all the way low down. Low fear, low anxiety, a nervous system that never learned how to sound the alarm the way everybody else's does. Chigurh reads as close to a textbook primary case as fiction has ever bothered writing, which circles back to that autonomic underarousal we opened this file with. It's not a metaphor for who he is. It's closer to the actual biological engine running underneath everything he does on screen. Psychopathy isn't about somebody being wild or unpredictable. It's about a person operating with a flat internal response to things that normally trigger fear and hesitation in anybody else. And Chigurh's entire body of behavior across this film tracks that description with almost uncomfortable precision. No arousal to violence or guilt, because guilt would require him to accept that he's actually the one choosing. The coin isn't mercy, it's an alibi he tells himself before he ever tells it to anybody else. His code isn't honor either, even though a lot of casual viewers read it that way. Consistency without a conscience isn't honor. Compare that against Belle's doubt running through the whole film, and you get the movie's real thesis handed to you plainly. Doubt, uncomfortable as it feels, sitting inside you, is actually the sound of a functioning conscious doing its job, and Chigurh simply doesn't have one left to make that sound. People love to call this kind of person a philosopher, and I have to push back because I think it lets him off too easy. And a real philosopher would be to test an idea against opposition, to sit the possibility it might be wrong and see if the idea survives that pressure. Chigurh never does that. He recites his own conclusions at people right before he kills them, which isn't philosophy. That's just a man performing intellectual authority over somebody who has no ability to argue back because they're about to die. It's the easiest kind of debate to win, the kind where your opponent doesn't get a turn. There's a reason this film ends the way it does. It's about making its final, most uncomfortable point directly to you, sitting wherever you're sitting. Some forces don't get satisfying conclusions, and some violence just moves to the next town. Bill closes the film about two dreams he had about his father. In the second one, the one he lingers on, his father rides ahead of him through the cold and the dark, carrying fire in a horn in the way the old settlers used to carry embers from one camp to the next, so the flame wouldn't go out along the way. Bell says he knew his father would go on ahead and get the fire built up somewhere in all that dark and cold, and that whenever he got there, his father would be waiting for him. Sit with what that image is actually doing at the very end of a film this bleak. Mel isn't dreaming about catching Sugar. He isn't dreaming about justice or arriving late either. He's dreaming about a child again, following someone who still had the strength to carry warmth through darkness on his behalf. The film spent 2 hours how extraordinary violence is in mundane settings and closes by showing you an extraordinary confession of grief delivered in the most mundane setting available. Same trick, opposite emotion. Chigurh made horror feel like small talk. Bell makes small talk feel like the most vulnerable thing a person can do at a breakfast table. Chigurh represents something cold and modern, completely untethered from any older code of meaning, moving through the world with total confidence because he answers to nothing outside himself. Bell represents the exhausted, doubtful, generational weight of somebody who still believes there's supposed to be a fire worth carrying, even if he's no longer sure his hands are steady enough to carry it. One of them sleeps fine at night. The other one is left dreaming about his dead father, just to feel, for a few seconds, like the world still needs a kind of sense it clearly doesn't make anymore. If you're looking for actually who pays the price in this story, it was never really Moss, and it wasn't Carla Jean either. As much as their deaths angered the plot, it was Belle, carrying the exhaustion of the entire worldview for 2 hours while the thing that killed it walks away with a broken arm and a stranger shirt tied around it. Dread scale. Chigurh sits at a 10 out of 10, and that's not a number handed out casually on this channel. He earns it, and not because he's the most violent one, of course. There's a lot of horror movies that have higher body counts. He earns it because he's the villain with the least amount of anything you could actually use against him. No temper to exploit or obvious weakness to bait. What would you actually do standing across from this man? Run? He's always accounted for that. Reason with him? He's calmly explained why your reasoning doesn't apply to him. before ending the conversation permanently. Appeal to mercy? He'll offer you a coin flip instead and somehow make that feel like the generous option compared to whatever the alternative would have been. There's no move left on the board once you decided you're in the game. And that, more than any single kill in this whole film, is the real horror. To compare, most villains get beaten by something like a flaw somebody found or weakness. Chigurh doesn't lose to any of that across the entire film. He loses to a car running a stop sign, which is the least dramatic and least meaningful defeat that you could possibly hand a character built this carefully. And I think that's the whole joke this movie is making out of his expense without ever cracking a smile about it. One last question worth carrying with you longer than the others. If a person can convince themselves that a coin flip removes their own responsibility for a choice they've already made, what smaller version of that same trick, maybe running quietly in rooms that you actually stood in yourself? Most of us will never meet running this exact philosophy at this exact volume. But almost all of us have met somebody who found a smaller version of it, somebody who needed to believe the outcome wasn't really their choice, so they never had to sit with how they made it. Chigurh's just the version of that instinct, with absolutely nothing left inside him to slow it down. That's the file closed. Fear is the only honest thing. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.